صباح الخير, بوكر tov, good morning. Elisha, we can start, right? אוקיי, אנחנו מתחילים את הפאנל הראשון ליום השני של הכנס, איך אומרים, עודה בעברית.
The session this morning, how to say Awda in Hebrew. The first panel is going to have 3 sessions with a small change in the program because of reasons that are not connected to us. The chair will be Ms. Shumari. She's a part of the team of Badil in Bethlehem that deals with the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank. Is the English coming through? Good morning. Is it okay? Thank you. Thank you. She's also going to manage to be the chair of the panel, and she's also going to participate in the discussion, and she'll tell us about the activity of Badil in the places where they act and are active. And she'll present one of the ways that the Badil organization does in the field for the promotion of the culture of return or the demand for the right of return. The first session or chapter in this panel is going to be a movie that came from Jordan, prepared by an activist and a researcher who lives in Jordan. We'll show her in a minute, and also Lubna is going to tell us about it. So we hope it's going to be an interesting panel, and finally, of course, Q&As. Again, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Ready for round 2? As Omar said, there have been some slight changes to the program today for external reasons of the speakers. But as he also said, we have 3 interventions today. So we'll start right away with the first intervention from Nadya Tannous. Nadya is a Jewish Palestinian American born and raised in the Bay Area, California. She has a BA in anthropology from US Santa Cruz and a Master's of Science in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford. She's a passionate community organizer with a focus on refugee rights, transitional justice, youth education, and intercommunity empowerment movements. She currently works and resides in Jordan, so she wasn't able to be with us today, but we will see her very short film documentary.
Hi everyone, my name is Nadya Tannous. I'm giving this presentation from Amman, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person. But in the meantime, from here, I'm just going to give the presentation on double displacement and partial protection, the paradox of Palestinians as constant refugees. This presentation today is going to be structured in more of a narrative form. And so the goal of the presentation is to really give you an image of what Palestinian refugees are going through in exile today as protracted refugees. Due to the absence of viable return for Palestinian refugees in the Middle East, most Arab countries have been and are wary of taking on more Palestinians within their borders or extending responsibility to them as refugees without a solution of repatriation in sight. Displacement is not a static event. It is a continual event. There's different experiences in displacement. And really, the paradox here is that for Palestinians, there arises the reality that they can't access protection, they can't access assistance during their times of double or triple displacement because they were already Palestinian refugees in the first place. And so their primary displacement and refugee status or non-status basically bars them from accessing protection upon secondary or tertiary displacement. So the last numbers that we have of Palestinian Syrian refugees in the region comes from Human Rights Watch, and they only covered Lebanon. So that was in December 2015. The most updated numbers for Syria and Jordan come from Human Rights Watch in 2014, 2012. It's very, very difficult to document any sort of mass refugee flow, like exact numbers and details and where people are going and where they're from. But it's also really difficult to map Palestinian refugees who are being displaced for a second and third time because they are a minority within the larger refugee flows and they're improperly documented. This lack of kind of standard documentation for Palestinian refugees, or their non-status, we can say, really contributes to the refoulement from neighboring borders and supports their lack of access to adequate protection once they get inside of these countries. An example is almost all Palestinian Syrian refugees currently lack legal status in Lebanon. The current process of non-registration in Jordan has been really crippling for them. They can't register themselves as legal refugees because they don't have the proper paperwork. And so, in part, as I said before, they're actually excluded from refugee protection because they're already pre-acknowledged refugees in another country from another situation. And this contributes to both their exceptionalism in international law and in local refugee policy. Because when crises occur in the region, the response is really geared towards assisting those refugees who are being displaced for the first time, such as Iraqis from Iraq or Syrians from Syria. And so national and international protection strategies exclude Palestinian Iraqis and Palestinian Syrians because they were already refugees and their root problem really has yet to be resolved. This picture here is from the Suf camp in Jarash, which is one of the original Palestinian camps in Jordan. And so this is the picture of Palestinian refugees in first displacement. As many of these case studies are focused around refugee flows into Jordan, I want to provide a quick overview of Jordan's legal foundation when it comes to refugees. First and foremost being that Jordan is not a signatory to the CSR 1951, so that's the Convention on the Status of Refugees. They're not a signatory to 1951 CSR nor the 1967 Protocol, which is what the international premise of refugee law is based off of. And that goes for many other countries in the Middle East, including Syria, which means that refugee policies coming out of this region are specifically based on national policies, not on international procedure. So what many of you may know is that Jordan has no official refugee law or asylum procedures to date, and it instead permits the entry of refugees as guests, which is actually commonplace in many Middle Eastern countries. What many of you may not know, however, is that Palestinian Syrians were first mixed in with refugees coming from Syria between 2010 and 2012. By mid-2012, all Palestinian Syrian refugees were not allowed to cross the border. And Human Rights Watch really documented this well at the beginning, as did IRIN, which is used to be part of the UN and is now an independent reporting source and auditing source. And so, though the numbers of Palestinian Syrian refugees seems to have paused on the Jordanian border, my interviewees seem to think that this is due to Jordan becoming better at securitizing the border and controlling the refugee flows, and not because less people are coming, which makes a lot of sense to me as well. So we're going to quickly look over these case studies. The first case study is Palestinian Iraqis stranded at the border crossing with Jordan and Syria from 2003 to 2009. The second case study is Palestinian Syrians stranded at the border with Jordan and refouled from 2012 to now. And then the third case study is just a basic look at fluctuating camp life. So in Iraq, you have the fall of the regime of Saddam Hussein and the U.S. Army invasion of Baghdad in April 2003. In July 2003, UNHCR registered about 22,000 Palestinians in Baghdad, but was unable to count those in Mosul and Basra and other areas due to their isolation and mass-scale violence. And so pre-2003, Palestinians were not required to obtain any official residency permits, and they were largely indistinguishable from the rest of the population. But after the fall of Saddam and his national Palestinian refugee policies, Palestinians were basically left paperless, and UNRWA does not have a mandate in Iraq. And so Palestinians had to apply for residency on a 2-month rolling basis, which was very risky because reapplication for residence gave people an updated address of where you lived during a time of targeted violence against Palestinian Iraqis. And there was also a widespread violence and general collapse of the Iraqi state, as we all know, but Palestinians were also picked out, they were targeted, and they were threatened inside of Iraq because they were seen as supporting Saddam, and they were mostly Sunni. And so they were facing persecution by Iraqi security forces, national militant groups, and foreign armies. So in light of all this, Palestinian Iraqis fled to the Jordanian border, and they were banned entry upon arrival. They were unable to cross into Jordan on tourist visas or as guests, like their Iraqi national counterparts, and a small faction of the larger group kept pushing themselves, and they pressed themselves into this area of no man's land, which is a strip of harsh desert between the Iraqi and Jordanian border, and they only lasted a few days without provisions. Those who were of mixed marriage with Iraqis were permitted as guests, but the others were refouled. And in the spring of 2005, there was a standoff with border militia and Iraqi Palestinians, and this particular group became stuck in limbo in this no man's land once again, and they were technically in non-nationalized neutral territory, and so they couldn't move forward, and they were unwilling to go back to Iraq, understandably. Human Rights Watch at this time, in 2005-2006, pressured Jordan to open its borders, and the group was ebbed into al-Ruwashed camp, which is 50 kilometers past the Jordanian border, and it's also located in inhospitable deserts. Al-Ruwashed is one of the worst documented at the time because it didn't have access to education for children. The tents caught on fire during extreme conditions. No one was allowed to leave. No one was allowed to visit without state-issued permits. And so when around 200 Palestinians fled to Jordan a few months later, they were again denied entry. So you have those who are denied entry and those who are in this really inhospitable living situation inside of the camp. In 2005, around the same time, in October, with evidence of this difficulty going into Jordan, many more Palestinian Iraqis headed for Syria's border. And Syria, as Jordan had before it, closed its borders to those of Palestinian ancestry upon arrival. But under pressure again from Human Rights Watch, Syria allowed 19 of them to cross into the Al-Hol camp in the desert just on the Syrian side of the border. In late April 2006, Syria confirmed that it would actually absorb this particular group, but as more joined and were permitted into Al-Hol without clear legal status or the right to work or the freedom of movement, basically the Syrian regime closed the borders to Palestinian Iraqis once again. And so these people settled themselves in a camp that was a makeshift camp called Al-Tanaf and Al-Walid. And lots of people were being refouled back to Baghdad. And so those who were remaining in Al-Tanaf, they really had nothing. They were too afraid to go back to Baghdad, and they were trying to resist deportation and refoulement. And so due to the famously egregious conditions in Al-Tanaf, many of these people were resettled to places like Canada, Australia, Sweden, because no near country was willing to take them. And however, many from Al-Tanaf were also transferred into Al-Hol within Syria in early 2010, and at the time it was heralded as this big success. And Al-Hol is still situated next to a regime army base. So in the aftermath of the Syrian conflict, we see a cause of tertiary displacement for the Palestinian Iraqis who had gone to al-Hol and are now trying to get out of Syria. So looking at the Syrian to Jordan refugee flows, it's important to note that Jordan continues to adopt an open border policy officially to all Syrians trying to enter Jordan, but according to the document made available to me by an anonymous but reputable source, there were 754 observed cases of non-admission under the Jordanian-Syrian borders from January to April 2015. And this number doesn't differentiate between Syrian and Palestinian Syrian refugees because it's very, very difficult to do. But we know that refoulement and deportation is continuing to happen on a regular basis for Palestinian Syrian refugees, for Palestinian Iraqi refugees, for Syrian refugees in Jordan, for Jordanian refugees in Jordan, for other refugees in Jordan. And so in August 2014, it was estimated by Human Rights Watch that over 14,000 Palestinian Syrians were living in Jordan, and that only 1,300 of them had entered legally before Jordan officially banned entry to them in mid-2012. And so as these refugee flows coming from Syria peaked, Jordan simultaneously kind of implemented this brand of new non-admittance policies, and it created a particularly critical scenario for Palestinian refugees in the Levant, as most of Syria's neighboring countries have also placed entry restrictions on Palestinians from Syria. And as Adam Kugel said in an interview that I had with him in 2015, he's from Human Rights Watch, they knew that Palestinians had been refouled at the border since 2012, and although they didn't know exactly what the number was, or what they are today, they know that it's likely a very large number. And in 2013, Abdullah Ansur, who's the Prime Minister of Jordan, said that Jordan has made a clear and explicit sovereign decision to not allow the crossing into Jordan by our Palestinian brothers who hold Syrian documents. So the important part of this statement is that officially Palestinians who are fully documented would not be denied entry into Jordan. However, as I said earlier, it's almost unheard of for Palestinian Syrians to obtain legitimate non-Palestinian identification cards. And thus, Palestinian Syrian refugees are excluded from entering Jordan because they're not adequately documented. And this picture below is of an unregistered camp in Hadalat, just inside of the Jordanian border, where Palestinian Syrians were staying in 2014. And so moving on into the final case study, we're going to look at fluctuating camp life. It's very difficult to ascertain what the livelihood situation is for Palestinian Syrian and Palestinian Iraqi refugees within Jordan today. We do know that there are 3 official Syrian refugee camps in Jordan. There's many unregistered, but these official Syrian refugee camps are under the mandate of UNHCR, and they're managed by the MOI. And there's Zochrot, Emirati Jordanian camp, and Azraq camp. And the thing about them is that Palestinian Syrians cannot access them. So the only official camp that Palestinian Syrian refugees can access is Cyber City, which holds both Syrians and Palestinian refugees, but only if they are registered. So Cyber City has fluctuated between meeting the UNHCR definition of a detention center from 2012 to spring 2015. An example that might be more familiar to you all or closer to home is the Halot Detention Center for Asylum Seekers. So we can see what an example is of detention centers versus a camp for refugees and or asylum seekers. However, Cyber City, as of now, according to word on the ground, as one of the better camp spaces today after Jordan changed its policies around Cyber City. So in presenting this information on Cyber City, I want to preface it by saying that nothing is stable for Palestinian, Syrian, and Palestinian Iraqi refugees inside of Jordan. So as we can see, even as a personal example, when I was first researching Cyber City for my master's thesis in 2014 and 2015, the status of those living in Cyber City was very, very different from what Cyber City is like today at present. And there are no guarantees. Cyber City could easily go back or revert even to another form of camp or detention center, depending on local Jordanian policy. And this continual instability is something that we should be keeping in mind when looking at refugee experiences and reports in the region in general. There are very, very few guarantees of stability. For example, although Syrian refugees in Jordan in 2012 could move and work freely in Jordan with a signatory, Palestinian Syrians could not, even though many of them had families in Jordan who were willing to guarantee them. As of late 2012, Jordan also discontinued this for Syrians in Jordan. And so what we see here, and what's really important to note, is a concerning pattern. After 67 years of protracted Palestinian Refugeehood and 5 years upcoming of the Syrian crisis, donor countries and local international aid agencies are slowing down their donations and their effective dispersal of humanitarian assistance. And as I said before, most of my interviewees from the international community showed major concern over this growing trend. It's donor fatigue, and there's also an altruistic fatigue that operates against all refugees. As Nadya said in an interview that we had in 2015, she says that does not romanticize the position of Iraqi or Syrian refugees either, because in their cases as well, host states also feel like they've had enough. They don't want to absorb refugees' situations anymore. Palestinians are highlighted because the policy against them is specific, and that's what makes them stand out. It's the fact that it's explicit rejection. Palestinians at present in Jordan have been barred from obtaining MOI cards, any other form of identity cards that designates them as a registered refugee. And these cards are super important because they allow refugees to access aid from UN organizations, as well as defining their legal status within the country. Currently, even the ITF, or the Interagency Task Force, which is the Jordan, also coined the Jordan Refugee Response, which is chaired by UNHCR, does not discuss issues relating to Palestinian Syrians. And this is the forum where local coordination mechanisms are basically laid out for aid agencies working on the Syrian refugee response in Jordan today. But in all this, it's also really important to recognize that Iraqi refugees were stuck at the border. Syrian refugees are refoulement. Refoulement is not just something that Palestinians deal with. And in that, they're not exceptional. They're exceptional because of their targeted refoulement through various policies and some of the protection gaps that they fall into, but protection gaps remain crucially relevant to the current massive refugee flows of the region and around the world. But Palestinians have been displaced for almost 7 decades, and it's largely within the surrounding countries in the region. And there is no comfortable space left. You can argue there never was, where they can receive adequate protection in times of max flux. And so it's clear to us that primary asylum is not a remedy for protection from further displacement and inequality for Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. And thus, their plight cannot be sincerely resolved until there is a political solution attained between Israelis and Palestinians that allows Palestinian refugees the right of return to historic Palestine. And that is what the long-term solution must be focused on. So in conclusion, the only adequate response as reconciliation for the original events that made Palestinians refugees is return. Thank you so much for attending this talk. Thank you, Zochrot, for having me. Again, my name is Nadya Tannous, and I am a Jewish Palestinian American living in Amman, Jordan. Unfortunately, due to Israel's xenophobic policies against my Palestinian heritage, I was not able to join you today. I wish that I could have been there to present in person. However, it's a return conference, right? So hopefully things that others and myself have been talking about today, we can take them into account in order to put return into practice and plan the future of a free and equitable place for all of us. And so I really look forward to that day. And yeah, hopefully see you all there. Thank you. Thanks all. Bye.
I think Nadya did an excellent job of covering the protection gaps faced not only by Palestinian refugees, maybe especially by Palestinian refugees, but all refugees, and the situation that is created in armed conflict, which forces people to leave their places of origin or habitual residence, and how this completely strips people of their rights and their ability to access services and protection, which I think is very important to understand and recognize. Just on the issue of non-refoulement, non-refoulement is identified by international law as the unwillingness or the return of those seeking asylum or refuge in another country and being turned back. This principle is supposed to be banned. It is banned according to international law, but unfortunately many countries, those who are signatories and those who aren't signatories to the 1951 Refugee Convention, are practicing refoulement, that is sending back refugees to those seeking refuge to situations in which is extremely life-threatening. Next we have a gentleman from his name is Sulaiman Fakhmawi, and Ustaz Sulaiman, I'm going to switch to Arabic if you will permit for a bit. أستاذ سليمان هو سكرتير وعضو إدارة جمعية الدفاع عن حقوق المهجرين في الداخل في 48. وهو كمان مهندس معماري ورئيس اللجان الشعبي للدفاع عن الأرض.
I'm sorry. No, Zani.
English.
The village of Zimat, I think that's what it's called. Now he lives in el-Fakhem, and he will speak about the mechanism of return.
صباح الخير. بوكر توب. Good morning. اسمحوا لي أن أتحدث بلغتي الأصلية.
Allow me to speak in my mother tongue, which is Arabic. And in order to present, I'd like to say how moving it is for me to be in a building called Rothschild, one of the people responsible for our uprooting and for the occupation of our lands. In this place, in this At this conference, we, the IDPs, the internal displaced persons who have been exiled from our Palestinian villages, and that happened in 1948, the ones who exiled us or expelled us were the Zionist soldiers, and some of us were deported outside the borders of our homeland. Some remained in the homeland, and those gangs drove people out. Some remained. It was their right to remain. Ben-Gurion thought that the story was over. The parents would die and that the sons would forget. And we said that the fathers died, the parents died, but the children did not forget. The second, third, and fifth generation. We are here. We will not forget. We will not forget the Nakba of the Palestinian people. He also said, Ben-Gurion, I made a very big mistake that I allowed any Arabs to remain here. This was a terrible mistake, he said, that I left any Arabs here in Palestine. Those are things that Ben-Gurion said. We say to him, thank you very much for that mistake. That mistake that you made is your mistake. That's your punishment. We will return to these villages that were destroyed in 48. 531 villages were destroyed, and their people, some were driven out beyond the borders, and some remained here. There were deportations and immigration. And since then, Palestinians thought to return the same day to their village, the same day that they were expelled. They tried to come back the very same day. Those who remained in their homes remained, and those who remained under their olive tree, there were those that remained outside the village a few meters away in the hope of returning. And indeed, there were efforts to return, and some of them did return. And there were attempts to return. Those that fell, those that were killed on the way back to their villages. Or when they tried to bring some belongings or food in order to survive, in order to remain at a small distance from the village until the return. That was one of the stages of the Awda. The Awda began on the very day when the Palestinian was expelled. I am a member of the second generation. I didn't live through that stage. I was born in 51. In 48, my parents were driven out, and I heard the stories from them. And I heard this discourse from my mother and from my father, because my father lived outside the village under the olive trees. And at night, he would sneak into the village to go get food and belongings, anything he could, in order to be able to survive. Afterwards, they began to move away from the village because the Haganah forces, the army forces, began to besiege the villages and persecute the people of the village. The second stage of the Awda, of the return, when our parents who were driven out, when they lived in the villages that were closest to their original village. Imagine, at first they lived under the olive tree next to the village, then they lived in the closest village nearby because they planned to return. They didn't want to get too far away. There are many examples, and I will give you some. One example I'll start with myself. I am from the village of Zinat, a Palestinian Arab village that is located in the Carmel Mountains near Haifa. The village numbered about 2,000 people at the time. During the time of the deportation, those who were driven out were driven out. The village was closed on 3 sides from 3 directions. They left one direction, one way out to the east. My parents and my family were driven out in buses. They were picked up in the village, and they closed off the place. They started to put them in buses and took them east across the Jordan to the northern triangle, which is called Eastern Jordan, according to the Rhodes Agreement. After Rhodes, that area became Israeli. And then my parents moved to the closest village of Dalyat al-Carmel, which is a Druze village. And the people of Dalyat al-Carmel accepted them because my parents had friends in the village. They lived there. So that is an example of Zinat. Let me give you an example of a very large village. Dalyat al-Carmel is only about 1 kilometer away from the village. They were quite close by, the 2 villages, very close. There is another very large village, Sophoria. The people of Sophoria were expelled, and those that remained lived in Nazareth. Nazareth is a few kilometers from Sophoria. In other words, those that lived in Safafra, in the neighborhood of Safafra, can see their own village with their eyes clearly, and that is a stage that emphasizes the desire to return. I live near my village so that I can go back as quickly as possible because I was expelled quickly and I will return quickly. That was the thought then. That was the Palestinian state of mind, that when we're talking about Awda, when we're talking about return to the village. And I am emphasizing here that most of the Palestinians that left and lived near the villages did not build stone houses, did not build real edifices. They lived in tents and in tin shacks because they didn't want to live in permanent housing. They realized that this was merely a stage, an interim stage, and they wanted to emphasize their desire to return in order to emphasize that the memory and the belonging and the land are in the mind and heart of every Palestinian. The 4th stage, which is the fight for survival, to be or not to be, to preserve my right to return and to live in a dignified manner, raise my children and work. And the refugees, they were called refugees. I could sense the experience of being a refugee in my village. Most of the Palestinians lived north of their own villages, and there were neighborhoods that were called refugee neighborhoods. We were not ashamed of being called refugees in order to preserve the desire to return to our villages. We were defined as those that refugees, because all the refugees who were driven out gathered and lived together in the same neighborhood. And there was a reason for that, because they wanted to maintain their social ties and preserve the community and to be strong together, to protect themselves together. It's strength. I would call this stage the 4th stage in the Palestinian memory. where the return is concerned. There was a stage, a difficult stage, when the land dealers arrived to convince people to sell their land, to leave their lands alone and not return. And I'm proud to say that I saw many documents sent to my father in which he was asked to and a lot of people refused to give that up. And that was because of the right of return, the mechanism of return. It didn't start now. It started from the first day when we were driven out of our villages and from our land. There was a period of fear when they tried to frighten us. There was a policy to frighten people during the military government, the period of pressure. All that was aimed at erasing the memory of return, and that policy failed until 1966. There was a military government in Israel, and all those who wanted to leave their villages, even to just go to the doctor, had to get permission from the military governor. And that policy did nothing to do away with the belonging to the land and the memory. And that's another mechanism of return, the tsumo, the attachment to the land. The most important stage was the insistence of our parents to educate us and teach us that we have a home and we have land. To this day, I remember what my mother told me. She's 90 years old. May she live a long life. She said, be careful never to give up the land. I hope very much to go back to the village, to Mezinat, and that my hair will mix and touch the olive trees, because that is my mother's legacy. My mother today is willing to give up everything she has to be able to return to her village. It's a stage of insistence to leave and bequeath that vision of return to us. I will move on to the stage of awakening among the Palestinian IDPs in the homeland. Return is not a new idea. It is an idea that has been on our minds since the first day. The activity of the IDP committee that was established in the 90s is connected to the idea of return, but it is our legacy. We inherited that state of mind since 1948 until the organization was established and we demanded a return. Of course, the first motivation was the Oslo agreements, where they talked about the IDPs in the Palestinian homeland. And it said something like it's an internal Israeli matter and not a Palestinian matter. Those who were driven out in 48 and are still in Israel, they're Israelis. But we say we are Palestinians. We are an integral part of the Palestinian state. And we are concerned about the matter of return. There's no difference between a refugee and an IDP. But we have a commitment. We live in our land. We have rights here. We have land here. We have our land registered in our name in the land registry. We have documents to prove it. We have the right to demand to return in every way possible. And that is why the organization was established. and we began to breathe life into the idea of return among the Palestinians of 48 and among the Palestinian society of 48 and Jewish society in Israel. Our goal is to bring this message everywhere. And I would like to say from this Rothschild platform that I will make my voice heard, and I say loud and clear, I will return to my village, I will return to my town. He who took away my right is bound to return it to me. I come from a Palestinian village, I will return to a Palestinian village. And therefore, we have a plan in the organization to raise awareness among Palestinians of 48, and especially among the younger generations, to explain to them that they have the right of return. And marches were held and processions that awakened the people and returned them for a single day to their villages. And we carried out that task, and we returned to our villages, and we went to visit them, those villages that were destroyed, in order to emphasize our right. There were many visits. We have day visits, weekly visits, yearly visits, and all this activity returns us to 48 and awakens our awareness that the right of return began in 48 and not in the 90s and not today. It's a historical right, a human right, an individual right, and a collective right. We do not have expectations of the international community. There is Resolution 194 that was never implemented, and all kinds of declarations that express solidarity with us, and that gives us some encouragement. And some of the civil organizations, collective or individual of the organizations, supplies us, gives us strength to continue and demand the right of return. Once I was asked, a British MP, some of whom did research to see how the IDPs could return to their villages. There are all kinds of plans. The world is developing. There's urban planning, industrial zones, tourism, and so on. And the answer was a very simple one. The way we came out, that's the way we'll go back. We will go back, even in a tent. And then we will plan our villages and towns in a modern way. Holding on to return means even to live in a tent. First of all, go back, return, and live in a tent, and then we'll build our houses just as we build our houses in the villages that have been hosting us up until now. We will be able to go back and build our villages in the same place, in the same way. And we demand this of the government of Israel. We're not ashamed to say so. And we stood on the podium of the Knesset in Jerusalem when it was decided to privatize the refugee assets. And we said in the Knesset, you have no right to sell a square inch of Palestinian land because it doesn't belong to you. You may be the guardians of the land, but anyone who tries to buy a square inch of Palestinian land will lose his money. I said that in Hebrew. Some of those present, it was the Finance and Committee and Interior Committee. They were amazed because there were about 300,000 IDPs in Israel, and they have registry papers for their property. And so I say, if I am given the choice to return to Zinat now, I will take my papers and go back without anything. It is not difficult at all to go back to the place that is waiting for you. The return is very easy. If we are told about demography and the number of residents, we are part of the population of Israel, 7 million. We will neither add nor subtract from the number. 77% are unpopulated, and that means that I could go back today to the village. 27,000 square meters. There is now a settlement called Eliakim that has invaded 3,000 dunams of our land. That means there is still land we can go back to. I say, and quite honestly, you can leave the settlement of Eliakim. It can remain there, and I will go back to Zinat. I'm not saying that I'll refuse to go back if I don't get all the land. And the same is true for all the Palestinian villages. The villages that are still empty and unpopulated, the people can be returned there. The presence of the return is everywhere, in every house and street, and even in the decisions of the state of Israel. A law was passed. They were supposed to pass a law to shut people up, to keep them quiet, and not enable people to even say the word Nakba. They wanted to pass a law that says that anyone who talks about Nakba, who revives the idea of Nakba, will be considered to be breaking the law. And they spoke about every organization or any organization that supports the right of return will have to pay a fine. That's the law in Israel. A local government that helps to revive the Nakba will pay 10,000 shekels times 10 from its budget. But I say that the return is possible, and the mechanism is possible if we conduct a survey among all Palestinians and ask them if they want to return. They will say, I want to return. Do you want to give up your property? Yes, I am willing to return, to give up everything I have in order to return to my original village. An example, the organization to protect the IDPs, when the National Master Plan 39 was published, they tried to erase all the villages, and we submitted an appeal to the regional committee, and we said, you have no right to erase these villages. If you want to expand Nazareth, drive out the people of Sephoria to Sephoria. I am willing to be moved from El-Fahim and somebody else from Tamra or Kfar Yassif to return to Bassa or Rabsia or Nahal and Tel al-Ghazal and Jabba, and Tirat el-Karmel and Atlit to Kafren, and to all the other 531 villages. I thank you for listening, and I hope that I have been successful in presenting the message of how we think about the mechanism of return.
Shukran, Ustaz Sulaiman. The paths of return, I think, can be as complicated as the situation is today, and there is no one path, but there could be many paths and many mechanisms developed that would take into considerations the rights of Palestinians and the rights of Israelis. We've been also asked today to talk a little bit about Badil. I'm not going to go to the podium. I'm going to stay right here. And I'm going to try not to take up too much of your time, because if there's a possibility, I think there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions. And I think that many people have questions, and I think that we are obliged to provide answers if we can, if we know the answers. Or develop the answers together, maybe. Just a little bit about Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. Badil was created in 1998. And why is this date important, or what does it signify, let's say? 5 years after Oslo. And the reason being was that the Palestinian refugee and IDP community was very dissatisfied with the Oslo Accords even at that time. And the reason being is that the Oslo Accords pushed the refugee and IDP issue to final status negotiations. And so after a series of seminars and workshops that occurred in historic Palestine and abroad among refugee individuals and IDP communities and refugee communities, it was decided that they needed an organization specifically intent or set upon protecting and promoting and defending their rights according to international humanitarian and human rights law. And so since that time, this is what Badil has attempted to do. Currently, we're implementing a strategy called Advancing a Rights-Based Solution, and it has two main pillars. The first pillar is empowering rights holders. And within this pillar, we attempt to increase the capacity, the awareness, and empower Palestinian refugee and non-refugee and IDP communities to understand their rights according to international law, so that they can demand their rights according to international law, and unify the messaging coming from Palestinian civil society. Our second pillar is called Influencing Duty Bearers, and through this pillar we try to engage with international decision makers and duty bearers, such as the UN, such as the European Union, the United States, those that have the power to create and influence and make policy change. To this end, we have what is called special consultative status with the United Nations, and basically what it means is that Badil is able to participate in all the UN forums, and so we are very active with the UN. We have an office in Geneva with a representative in Geneva, and currently we are quite active in the current United Nations Human Rights Council sessions. We advocate with the special rapporteurs, particularly the special rapporteur on human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory of 1967, as well as the special rapporteur on adequate housing, and many of the other treaty bodies, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Universal Periodic Review of States, and so on and so forth. But what makes Badil unique as an organization, a Palestinian human rights organization, is that our work is founded on both frameworks of international humanitarian and human rights law. What we present through our research is something that is founded on all the principles and the conventions that we find in these frameworks. So we're not pulling things out of the sky or out of our heads or out of other places, but we use the frameworks of international humanitarian and human rights law. Our approach is very comprehensive in that we are the only organization that works to promote and defend the rights of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. This makes our geographic mandate quite large, because today when you see where Palestinian refugees reside, we have Palestinian refugees residing, of course, in the West Bank and Gaza. We have Palestinian IDPs across historic Palestine, including the territory of 1948 and the territory of 1967. We have Palestinian refugees almost in every country around the world. And so when we talk about, for example, the first presentation that we saw today on tertiary displacement, or secondary or tertiary displacement of Palestinian refugees being forcibly transferred from Syria, from Iraq, from other areas as well. We also try to act and respond in terms of trying to get some sort of protection provided to Palestinian refugees. And finally, the third thing that makes Badil a unique organization is that we don't limit ourselves in terms of time. So when we look at the forcible transfer, displacement of Palestinian communities, groups, individuals, we go back as far as 1917 at the start of the British occupation and the British mandate of Palestine, up through the existence of the State of Israel to today. What some people may not realize, although I do feel that most of our speakers today highlighted or brought to attention this issue, is that we're not talking about just historic displacement or transfer. We're talking about something that is ongoing. So even as we talk today about the displacement of Palestinian refugees and IDPs for a second and third time, there are new groups, new Palestinian groups being displaced today. So the numbers are increasing as time goes on, and this is one of the things I think that also needs to be significantly addressed. At Badil, we are located in Bethlehem. I mentioned that we have an office in Geneva, but our headquarters is in Bethlehem. We have currently a staff of 16 people. And we're divided into basically 4 departments or 4 units. One of the units is the Research and Documentation Unit, which is the one that works to document human rights violations and crimes. That's where most of our fact-based research or evidence-based research comes from. I encourage you to go to our website, www.badil.org, to have a look at our publications and the research that we produce, as well as have a look at the other activities that Badil does. We also have an advocacy unit where we work on both legal and international advocacy. And I mentioned a little bit about the legal advocacy, but we also work in international advocacy. Another unit we have, of course, is the unit that I'm head of, which is the Admin Finance Unit, and that's the one that does all the boring stuff, like, proposal writing, fundraising, reports, and that sort of thing. And then we have the campaign or the mobilization unit. And within this unit, we have a number of different programs and projects that targets Palestinian civil society. I'd like to just mention one of the projects that we have, which is an annual project. It's called the annual Al-Awda Award, or an annual return award. And within this project, we try to encourage Palestinian civil society to express themselves artistically and culturally or through other means in order to revitalize or keep the memory and the remembering that Ustaz Suleiman referred to earlier as part of the mechanisms of return, or remembering the Nakba and trying to present their feelings through artistic and creative productions. So we have the annual poster in which many youth use as a means to express themselves by creating a poster. Each year we have a theme for the poster. I believe that the theme for this year is the same as our main slogan, which is "Return is our right and our will." And so we usually, this category is the biggest category and the most popular, let's say, category within the award, because the winning poster that is used for the annual Nakba commemorations. And so it's used both, it's not used inside Israel, but it's used in all the 67 territory, as well as used abroad. It's used also by the PLO and the Department of Refugee Affairs. and the Palestinian Negotiation Support Unit as the main poster for the commemoration of the Nakba. Usually the submissions, they come from a variety of Palestinian youth, not just necessarily from the 67 territory, but also from 1948, as well as abroad. And I'm getting the signal to wrap it up, so I'm going to. But if you would have any questions regarding this or anything else, please do feel free to approach me during the breaks. Oh, we'll have a Q&A now? Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions, and so I'd like to ask those who have questions. I see, okay, so they're going to have a microphone and they're going to pass it around. So do we have any questions? There's a gentleman over here who has a question.
It works? Yeah.
Hajj time. Okay.
My name is Uri Davis, and I have a question to Mr. Fahmawi and also to the presenter of the text on the screen, Ms. Tannous, I think was her name. I can ask my question in Arabic, in Hebrew, and English, but we have international visitors, so I'll ask my question. It's a question each in English.
Okay.
My first question is to the scholar Tannous. Why would Palestinians fleeing from or being expelled from Syria and Iraq be totally without documentation? Do they not have UNRWA refugee documents? And in the event they do, to what effect these documents function as a tiny measure of protection? The question to architect Fahmawi, I hesitate, and I take the liberty to ask it because I actually do not have the answer, and he may or may not have the answer. I also hesitate because I'm speaking from a protection of huge privileges. I'm a citizen of Israel, I'm of European origin, I'm of Jewish origin, I'm a citizen of Israel. I was born into the settler colonial society, whereas Slimane was born into the colonized society. So it's with great hesitation that I ask the question, and with a degree of humility. Why is Arakib the only instance, to my knowledge, where the will of the people is equal to the criminal will of the settlers? Arakib was built and returned, built and returned, built and returned 90 and more times until, and the count is still going. That's the only instance that I am aware of the kind of will, implementation of the will to return that is on par with the criminal will of the settlers to rob more and more land. Why is Arakib the only instance? As far as I know, I don't know the answer. Maybe Slimane has part of the answer. Thank you.
Okay. Do we want to take more questions before we start answering? Okay. Yeah. I'll go ahead and answer. Okay.
I'm curious to know what is the relationship, if at all, between UNRWA and Badil, or if there is a position of the organization about the work of UNRWA.
Okay. All right. أنا بدي أجاوب السؤال الأول والثاني أستاذ. الأول والثالث اللي انسألوا، بترك لك مجال تجاوب السؤال عن الكربيت.
الثالث ما سمعتوش.
طيب أوكي، ما هو إلا عن الأونروا.
الأونروا.
In terms, UNRWA only established areas of operations in the West Bank and Gaza, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. So Palestinians who became refugees and fled to those areas, they were provided with UNRWA registered cards. Now, there's a significant number of Palestinian refugees who were not provided or didn't go to the UNRWA areas of operation, and therefore they were not able to access or be able to be registered as UNRWA registered refugees. And so, if you recall from yesterday, there's approximately 1 million Palestinians who are not officially UNRWA registered. And so in Iraq and in Kuwait and in Tunis and in Algeria and in all the other countries where Palestinians had fled and continue to flee, there is no way to get official documentation or registration through UNRWA. Further, if we're talking about the ongoing forcible transfer that occurred, or forcible displacement that occurred for Palestinians after 1967, there is no international organization that is registering the current ongoing transfer of Palestinians. And so Badil, when they do the survey on Palestinian refugees and IDPs, they try and get these numbers. So, for example, when OSHA documents home demolitions in Jerusalem or in Silwan or in Area C or so on and so forth, they document the fact that the home was demolished, and they document the number of people affected. But then there's some humanitarian assistance provided. But then what happens? What happens to these people? Where do they end up? Do they end up staying in the country? Do they go somewhere else? Do they go from occupied East Jerusalem into the West Bank? Or, you know, so there's no current way to provide documentation to Palestinian refugees. In some cases, because what Nadya was talking about, and the issue of refoulement and returning Palestinian refugees or denying them entry at the border, many Palestinian refugees don't claim to be Palestinian refugees, because even if they have the official documentation and the cards, they will not be allowed asylum in Jordan and Lebanon and even in Turkey, where they have very restricted and discriminatory practices and policies towards Palestinian refugees. So they hide their cards, and they show that, and they pretend to be or say that they are Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees or what have you. And UNRWA's mandate is only to provide humanitarian aid. So they do not provide any type of assistance or legal or physical or what have you. Badil and UNRWA have a very close relationship, although they will not admit it. They seek our consultation and our opinion quite regularly and quite often. Just last week, the unit of UNRWA's operations in the West Bank made a visit to Badil. They wanted to launch a new program, and they wanted to see how, or ask Badil's advice on how to approach this program. I'm going to stop there because, as usual, I talked a little too much, and I'm going to give the floor to Ustaz Suleiman to talk about al-Arakib.
صديقي أوري أنا قلت في البداية أنه بن غوريون قال أننا أخطأت خطأ كبير جدا في ترك العرب هنا في الداخل.
Here, I think that Arakib is part of the Zionist kind of thinking. It's part of the problem that Ben Gurion created, and today we see that the policy of displacement, of deportation of the Palestinians in the Negev, this was a policy which is methodical, Israeli, in order to empty the Negev from all its original inhabitants and to deport them and to bring them over into cantons like Rahat. Rahat is a city where they gathered more than one Bedouin tribe, and they seized their lands. They uprooted them from their villages. The original population in Arakib, they learned a lesson not to leave your home or your land and to continue to protect it, even if you live today in the cemetery. And you know, today the inhabitants of Arakib get the protection in the cemetery. Today they build it, tomorrow they destroy it. And I'm saying that this is a policy, and the issue of Arakib is part of the continuous Zionist ideology that wants to exile all Palestinians from their land. And today there's some sort of an awakening regarding holding on to the land. And today there's also a project of uprooting and exiling a Bedouin village that has 500 people in it. And through a project to establish Kfar Chiran, a village in Hebrew instead of the Arabic name, and the deportation of the Arakib people. They are the landowners, and they have all the rights, and they're going to defend their lands. And we, as an association to protect the rights of the displaced, I'm saying that this year we're going to have the return journey in the Negev, the march, the 19th march of return, and one of the villages that were demolished in 48, and it's going to be on the May 12th. And their Independence Day is our Nakba Day, the day when Israel got its independence. We got our Nakba, and this will be in the village of Wadi Azubala. The march is going to take place there, and also in order to stand side by side with the Negev people so that they can continue to live in their villages or go back to them. Uri's question was a little bit different. It's true that Arabic was part of the Zionist ideology. Why isn't it not part of the Palestinian ideology? Why is there return in Al-Rib and not in other places? Why can't we emulate it and duplicate it in other places? No. There's nothing sensitive that we cannot talk about. We said we can't hear him. I think he's not speaking into the microphone. Yeah. I'm saying that Arakib is a case of return, and it is a mechanism of return. And I don't expose here any plans how to think about return and what we're going to do tomorrow or the day after. We really respect the inhabitants of Arakib and their style in the return. And we also have plans and mechanisms. And as I said, the return mechanism is part of the plan of our association to protect the rights of the displaced, and also for those of 48, so that they can go to their villages in more than one way. And as I said, the visits, the marches, and establishing summer camps and other activities.
If I may also, I'd like to answer. And this is just purely my opinion, and it's of course a very humble opinion, because I think many of you know or have realized that I didn't really live here for quite a long time and wasn't really exposed to much of the hardness, let's say, of the conflict. But when you think about what happened in 1948, and you talk about 85% of the existing Palestinian population being forcibly transferred, either becoming refugees and IDPs, 85% of the existing Palestinian population became either refugees or IDPs. The social fabric, the culture, everything was ripped apart completely. And only 15% of the population actually stayed in their places of habitual residence or of origin, and Arakib was one of those. And so I think that there is a realization among the people of Al-Araqib that maybe hasn't quite come to maturity among other Palestinian communities. In that if you don't hold on to it tenaciously, if you don't do what is being done in Al-Araqib, then there is no there is no other way. Yani this, and I agree with you. This is the way it has to be, where the will of the Palestinian people to remain in their place must be stronger than the will of the state that is trying to forcibly transfer them. But seeing what happened, or not seeing, but realizing that what happened in 1948 completely obliterated Palestinian civil society, and then having another thing happen in 1967, which also broke apart Palestinian culture and civil society. So there's still a period, and it's not an excuse, I'm just making an observation. Not that I'm trying to make excuses for us, but I'm just making an observation that we're still recovering from this. And I see now that we are beginning to come to terms with what happened in 1948 and 1967, and try to get beyond the issue that al-Awda is, sacred and so on and so forth, and we need to do something to actually take the situation into our own hands and do what is happening. For example, in Al-Araqib and in other communities where return is being attempted.
Great, thank you very much. No, sorry, لا تأسف المرة الجاي. إذا جملة بس
اولا العراقيب
لا هذا نقاش، هذا
لا مش نقاش، هي بس معلومه
انه ايش؟
انه العراقيب مش المثال الوحيد. اقرف كمان مثال، وفي
يختلف ولكن صح، في محاور مضبوط، في محاور اخرى باقرف بتكون رجاء مضبوط.
اقرف هاي حكينا مثال اللي هو كان قائم. اوري انت بتتناسى انه كمان في مؤسسه صهيونيه قامعه جدا وعنيفه لتمارس قمعها وعنفها على كل أي محاولة عودة. يش إتها مشتار هاد صهيوني هدك همي ترستي شيء دكاء في مدكاء الكل نسيون في خشيبة براكتي على لحظة كيلو تورتان في إكرة قد دمالي بكوي خزري شد كذا.
ماشي، إكرة راح تكون اليوم مع المنصة وراح يحكوا عن الحالة تبعتهم بالتفصيل.
Okay, they'll be on stage today and they'll speak about their issue privately. Thank you. We're taking a break of half an hour, and at 12 o'clock we're going to have a new session with a new generation, the third generation, fourth generation of the IDP that think about the future and about the return.